disperse immediately, or you will be subject to arrest.
Scores of arrests and heavy gunfire as riots over the police killing of an unarmed black teenager in Missouri get worse. Is more coming tonight? Good evening. A black police officer in charge, a black president appealing for order, a black attorney general on his way. But nothing is working to calm the fury in Ferguson, Missouri. The shooting dead by a white police officer of an unarmed black teenager has unleashed something America seems unable to either control or placate.
Here in Ferguson, Michael Brown's killing has become a full-blown struggle over race, across generations, fueled by Twitter and tear gas. Also tonight, rail passengers aghast as season tickets set to go up by 3.5%. What are we getting for it? And will the government step in with a pre-election gift to cap the rise?
The standard of the trains hasn't been improved in any way, but the prices keep going up every single year.
You're always trying to fight to get on, and half the time you can't.
The brave chronicle of how Yazidis escaped the terror of Islamic State in Iraq. We have the accounts of one Kurdish photographer who travelled with them off the mountain. And is getting over adultery really the secret to a happy marriage? Paulo Coelho on his new novel, and much more besides.
I cannot tell you that I was the most faithful husband on earth, and the same goes for my wife.
9 days of riots over the police shooting of a black teenager, and despite President Obama's call for calm, the American town of Ferguson remains gripped by racially charged tension. Last night, police said they came under heavy gunfire. 78 people were arrested as officers fired tear gas and stun grenades in response. Our Washington correspondent Kylie Morris was out there overnight, and she joins us now live from Ferguson.
Well, Krishnan, certainly the police yesterday did try and de-escalate the situation, they said, by lifting the curfew. But it absolutely hasn't worked. As you mentioned, more arrests, more tear gas, more protesters on the street, and that enduring line between very heavily armed police on one side and very angry protesters on the other. Now, this has pushed this dispute into its second week, which is longer even than the tumult that followed the death of Rodney King in Los Angeles. And certainly here in Ferguson, there's no sign of calm in sight.
You need to disperse immediately, or you will be subject to arrest. Do it now.
No one's getting what they want in Ferguson. The police can't force the protesters away, and the protesters are no closer to justice for Michael Brown, killed 9 days ago by a white policeman. Instead, there's this. A violent nightly drama on a strip of road no more than half a mile. Tear gas, the favoured tactical weapon for police whose nerves are on edge. Twitter and smartphones, the preferred choice of protesters.
We shall overcome someday.
It starts peacefully enough. Elders bring the song and the spirit of the civil rights movement. Families bring their children.
You're not worried about the kids' safety at all? Or?
Yeah, we are. That's why they both have masks on. But, I mean, this is really important, especially for this one I got on me right now.
Your boy?
Yes, my son. And if anything happened to him, I don't know what I would do. We just tired of letting him get away with it.
A St. Louis superstar, the rapper Nelly, was there. He tells me he has no answers, but wants to support Mike Brown's family.
The support that we're getting is great, but right now these people want answers. Hey, let's go. They want answers.
How do you explain to people in Britain, for example, what's happening in Ferguson? Why is it important?
Why is it important? It's important to keep the word out. Definitely to show the support for the Brown family, because at the end of the day, that's what this is about.
Dead body. Live from Ferguson. They just killed him over reason.
There are no official answers. But if you want to know what happened to Michael Brown, you need look no further than YouTube. Here's his body prone in the street, filmed on mobile phone and uploaded after he was shot 6 times by the white policeman Darren Wilson.
What do you do? What do you do?
The continuum of anger that begins here links directly to the nightly protests, where they chant, "These killer cops, they've got to go."
Y'all don't even know who y'all dealing with in these streets, man. Yeah.
This young man's bad-mouthing hardly seems incitement, but police consult and then move in for an arrest. Moments like these inspiring accusations of police heavy-handedness.
Captain Johnson, can you just tell us why those guys were arrested, those two men?
We asked him to move on. He started saying, "I'll take your life if you mess with me," and he still wouldn't move on. And so that's why we heated up.
How do you assess things going so far tonight?
You know, there's pockets.
As we speak with Ron Johnson, a crowd forms, encircling the police commander with questions. The mood shifts.
If this is a community, we should be able to walk our streets. We should be able to go to our stores without having the threat of being killed in cold blood. We should have that right. This ain't no community. This is a hood. You want to know why I say hood? Because we don't feel safe in these streets. We never felt safe in these St. Louis streets, ever. Report that. Tell that. Don't walk around here sugarcoating stuff to the media.
Suddenly, no one's feeling safe. Tempers flare and more protesters push toward police. And with horrible predictability, the police line forms.
Disperse now!
Bedecked in their riot gear, brandishing weapons, backed up by armoured vehicles.
There's been a sudden escalation in kind of attitude and threats. We've seen some water bottles thrown. People are being told to back up. Suddenly thinks there's a water bottle being thrown even now.
We got to back up.
Okay, so we're being told to move back to the corner. Some of the elders in the community are trying to kind of form a line, trying to quieten everything down.
Come on, we just got to get them off the street.
But suddenly very tense. A real gear change.
No more killing!
Let's go!
Please!
Moments later, the police push forward to make another arrest, and we're waved to the ground by an officer who has us directly in his sights. It's only a matter of time before police reach for the tear gas after what they say was heavy gunfire.
There's been an outburst of tear gas, of smoke bombs. They've been using the sound cannon, and the protesters running away, wiping their eyes, looking for water to try and help them with the tear gas.
To disperse immediately, or you will be subject to arrest.
All in, more than 70 people were arrested. Shots were fired, tear gas clouded the streets. 9 days on, the divide in this middle American town appears wider than ever.
We're joined now by the community advocate, Brittany Packnett. Brittany Packnett, why do these protests just keep on going?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I've heard it said before that feelings buried alive don't die, right? And so what keeps happening is that people are feeling ire, they're feeling frustrated, they're feeling understandably angry over what happened and this killing of an unarmed young man in their community, and they're not able to get those frustrations out. They're not feeling heard by the power structure, they're not feeling heard by people that can really do something about this, and so they're going to keep showing up time and time again until they actually feel like they can be heard, and those feelings are being buried alive.
Aren't there other ways, though, to channel those frustrations, apart from kind of standing up and, you know, throwing bottles at the police? I mean, there does seem to be a kind of a hardcore element within the protests who are looking for trouble.
If that element exists, it's very small. Every night that I've been out there talking to our young people, trying to make sure that they feel heard and elevating their voice on social media, it's been peaceful. All of the nights that I've been out there, I've been amongst peaceful protesters, and we have been the vast majority of the people that have been on the streets. And so the unfortunate thing is that this situation continues to agitate people, and we want to be able to peacefully protest and then go home and resume to the process of getting justice.
When you talked about kind of long-held grievances, things buried deep, I mean, your family has had its own kind of direct experience with local police. Tell me about that.
Yes, I've grown up in this area and lived here almost my entire life, and the unfortunate thing is, while I know some incredible law enforcement officers, we have had some negative experiences, and my father's been pulled over before while he was an African-American male and college professor in an imported vehicle, and that happened over 20 years ago. And so when we think about the progress that has or has not been made, we can think very clearly about where we are and what's been happening over those decades.
I mean, There is a sort of a generational tension, isn't there? I mean, we saw lots of elders from the community out trying to tamp things down last night, and very angry young people saying, actually, no, this is my right to be here and protest.
Well, I really think that gap is starting to be bridged. Ever since, I say about Thursday, we've had members of the clergy and various community leaders out here marching with our young people. One of the clergy members actually said, we're sorry, because we should have been bringing the church to you this whole time instead of expecting you to come to the church. And they've been out here in days since. And so what I think is important to do is to really help bridge this generational gap and the language gap, right? Because adults kind of think that young people should channel their anger in certain ways, and young people don't always have the language, and so we have to give them productive outlets.
And to give the police their due, they are trying different methodologies. They've tried to stand back, they've tried a soft approach, they've tried to lift the curfew, and it seems to backfire on them every time.
I really think that the short-term solution here is the long-term solution, and that's community policing, right? And so when we think about what our communities can look like when law enforcement officers and parents and children all know each other, trust each other, and believe that they're all out here for good, then we can actually start to see an improvement to this short-term situation and in the long term.
So take off the helmets, take off the riot gear, walk amongst the people, that's the way to do it.
I think we have to talk to people. I think we have to build relationships. I think we have to say, we're different, but inside we're all the same. And so how can we come together and make sure that this is a place where we all want to live?
Okay, Brittany Packnett, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Eric Holder, I should just mention, the Attorney General is due here in Ferguson tomorrow, and the community will certainly be pressing for answers from him as to the full story of what happened to Michael Brown. Now it's back to you in the studio, Krish.
Thanks, Kylie. And you can read Kylie's reports from the midst of last night's trouble and watch her reports in full on our website, channel4.com/news. Now, train passengers face persecution, according to One Rail Union, after commuters today learned how much their ticket prices are likely to rise by next year. Fares are set to jump by 3.5%, faster than inflation, much faster than wages. There was some good news on the overall inflation picture today. Prices rose by 1.6% in the year to July. That's down from 1.9% in June. But another measure of inflation, the retail prices index, stood at 2.5%, the figure that's used as the basis for deciding rail fares. Train companies are usually allowed to put fares up by an extra 1%, giving an annual fare increase of 3.5%. That prospect was not popular with passengers, as our North of England correspondent Kieran Jenkins has been finding out.
The 812 from Bolton to Manchester is a right old squeeze. A season ticket on this route will set you back just under £1,000 a year. For that, you're lucky to even get on the train, never mind getting a seat.
You didn't get on your train, did you? Exactly. So it's not really value for money, because you're always like this. You're always trying to fight to get on, and half the time you can't.
Well, as if the morning commute wasn't struggle enough, prices are going up again this year. And they are going to eat into people's pay packets, because prices are going up, and they're going up faster than average increases in our salaries.
Today is the day each year that commuters must dread. We learn not whether fares in England will increase, but by how much. Anytime, off-peak intercity and those pricey season tickets all set for a hike.
The standard of the trains hasn't been improved in any way, but the prices keep going up every single year.
When it comes to stuff like this, where things go up and your pay doesn't increase, then it is quite upsetting. You just get frustrated and angry.
Under this government, rail fares have already gone up 25%, according to the Campaign for Better Transport. The latest increase will see fares rise another 3.5% from January next year. Salaries, though, well, they're nowhere near keeping pace, down 0.2% for the year to June. Labour's accused the government of ripping passengers off.
If you live in Swindon, the cost of getting into London is now £8,000 a year. Dover, it's £5,000. Milton Keynes, £4,700. And that is making life very difficult for people.
If this story sounds familiar, it's because it is. Each August, a formula automatically sets fares above inflation. Protests throughout the country this morning called on the government to abolish that formula, or at least cap increases, as it did, albeit under pressure, earlier this year.
So there's an unprecedented investment in the rail network, and it's right to say, well, should passengers contribute to that? Of course, but there needs to be a balance between passengers and general taxpayers.
There is no sign of train travel becoming any less popular. But if you do want to avoid the rail fare increases, here's one way of doing it. Where are you heading?
London.
Why are you taking the bus and not the train, do you mind me asking?
It's cheaper.
What would it take you to go back to the trains?
Cheap prices, really. It's way faster. It's like this is 2 hours extra or something like that. But
you're prepared to sit on a bus for 2 hours more just to save a few quid?
Yeah, a bit more than a few quid, but yeah, definitely.
The rail companies say surplus funds are reinvested in their services. Passengers, though, know what's coming, and it's going to cost them. Kieran Jenkins, Channel 4 News, Bolton.
Well, joining me now is the Rail Minister Claire Perry from her constituency in Wiltshire, and here in the studio, Mary Creagh, the Shadow Secretary of State for Transport. We'll speak to Claire Perry first. Is 3.5% fair?
Well, at the moment, all we know is the inflation number, which, as you say, good news, it came down to 2.5%. And because there is this squeeze on incomes as we come out of the biggest recession we've seen in Britain in peacetime, that's the reason we capped fares last year at RPI plus 0%, the first time that's been done in 10 years. It's something I would like to see again, but that kind of decision has to be affordable and has to be discussed with the Treasury. So all we know today is the RPI number of 2.5%.
Yeah,
but if I can just say, you know...
That's not what I asked you. I asked you, would 3.5% be fair?
Well, 3.5%, I don't know what the number is going to be next year. And we know that with an unprecedented investment in the railway network, electrifying almost 1,000 miles of tracks, actually electrifying the lines that you were just talking to commuters on to make sure there can be more capacity. What could be more frustrating than paying for a season ticket and not even getting on a train, let alone getting a seat? That's the situation we've got with the railways, which have been underinvested in for a long time, and we're putting that right. But we've got to make sure as we move towards a more comfortable commute that fares are fair. But, you know, this was the first time in 10 years...
I'm still not clear what you think of 3.5%, but anyway...
formula was held at 10%.
What you said is you're clear that you would like the Chancellor to act again in the autumn statement to limit it to just RPI, but we'll have to wait for his decision on that.
Yes.
So
well,
why
we've
do you
said quite clearly in the well, do you want the answer? So we've said quite clearly in the fare review that we want fare increases to be no more than RPI going forward. It doesn't seem right to actually have that kicker going forward, but at a time when you've got unprecedented investment in the rail network, everybody has to contribute.
Why do you use RPI for rail fares, but CPI, the lower measure, for pensions and benefits?
It's a really good question, actually. It's been used historically in the industry for all sorts of government contracts, and there's a review going on right now with I believe, the Office of National Statistics to look at RPI versus CPI. But at the moment, that's the basis on which all of the various franchises are let. It's the basis on which costs are developed, and that's historically been the basis on which fares are calculated.
So do you agree it's unfair?
Well, I agree it's what we're using right now, but there's a process of analysis going on. We are where we are with that increase.
So you have no opinion?
But overall, I think the challenge... look, the challenge is this. You've got a fare increase above inflation. You've had wages that have been squeezed really hard after the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. You've got a government that is making unprecedented steps to try and help with the cost of living, whether it's a tax cut for 24 million people, freezing fuel duty, or for the first time in 10 years, capping rail fares at RPI plus 0. So I'm interested to hear any idea, anything that reduces the cost to passengers. And frankly, the issue for passengers is after decades of underinvestment, they might be asking, what on earth are we paying for? And what we've got to have is a railway network that's fit for the 21st century. Stay
there, if you will, because I'm going to talk to Mary Creagh now, and then I'll come back to you for a moment. Mary Creagh, do you think 3.5% is fair?
Well, I think it's very difficult. What we've seen under this government is fares rising well in excess of 20% in just 4 years, at a time when average wages have risen by around 7%. We've called on the government to cap fares. We welcome last year's decision on that. We'd like to see that again this year. But what's most important is that people have confidence that what they're getting, what they're hearing about today, this 3.5%, that it doesn't go any higher, and the flexibility that the government gives that allows train companies to add on an extra extra 2% on that makes life very difficult for people.
That's the thing that Labour brought in when you were in power, isn't it?
When we were in power, 1997 to 2004, it was retail price index, or RPI, -1 for the first 7 years of a Labour government.
But the flex idea, that was a Labour policy, wasn't it?
It was.
You brought it in. Now you think it's silly, you want to scrap it.
We actually scrapped it.
So your predecessor was wrong?
What we did was in order to end the disaster that was Railtrack, to bring that, to set up Network Rail and do the investment to make a safe railway after the disaster of the Conservatives' privatisation policy, we had to spend money on the railways and we had to upgrade the West Coast Main Line. But the difference is that in 2010 we scrapped the flex, and Claire's wrong. Fares actually fell by 0.5% in 2010, and we were clear, had we been elected, that would have carried on.
The trouble is, voters could be forgiven for being a bit confused about what Labour policy is on the railways, because you won't say whether you are pro-renationalisation or not, will you?
We've been very clear. The fares policy is part of our biggest shake-up of the railways since privatisation. We can't understand why the government is so keen to put East Coast, a directly operated railway that will have delivered over £1 billion back to the taxpayer,
but will
back
you
out to the private
renationalise
sector.
the railways?
What we will do is set up a public sector operator that can bid against the private sector, that can take on lines and deliver best value for the taxpayer. What we've got to get away from is this old ideological debate, the Tories saying privatisation, Labour saying nationalisation. We've got a hybrid model at the moment. It's working. Why are the Conservatives so keen to put East Coast back out into the private sector?
Of course, one way you could pledge to reduce fares would be to scrap HS2. What's your policy on that?
Well, we think it's very important that we have that capital spend to make sure that the West Coast Main Line, which is essentially full, when we can't put any more trains on that line, we take the long-distance commuters from Manchester and further north eventually, and free up the West Coast traditional rail network for inter-regional and shorter intercity journeys.
So are you completely committed to HS2 going ahead?
We are completely committed. We voted for it at all stages in Parliament.
And that definitely won't change?
No, it won't.
OK, well, what do you think the government should do about getting investment into the railways if you want to keep capping fares? How are the railways going to be maintained? Because we all know they're not being maintained enough.
There's no plan for the railway. There's no 20-year plan that says how are we going to get step-free access, how are we going to make it easier for an ageing population to board the train, what are we going to do about making life easier.
No, those are the questions.
Areas.
What are the answers?
The answer is to have one single guiding mind to organise the railways. At the moment, the fragmented system means you have ministers like Claire sitting in Whitehall, or from the comfort. Claire talks about a comfortable commute. I'm sure it's very comfortable from the back of a ministerial car, but for the rest of us, it's very tricky to see how that commute is comfortable.
That's a bit of a cheat shot, isn't it? I mean, Labour ministers used cars as well, as I remember.
We certainly did, but maybe we'll change that when we get into government as well.
Oh, really? Well, that'd be an interesting policy commitment.
Watch this space.
Claire Perry, sorry, go on. What were you saying?
Well, look, I mean, I'm delighted that Mary recognises the need to invest in the railways. I mean, we have a 40 billion investment programme already delivering results in the country. Mary's government electrified less than 10 miles of track in 13 years. And electrification is a way to get more capacity on the network to give people faster and more reliable journeys. We will electrify 850 miles during this Parliament. So, you know, we can debate kind of political policies. I think the country is sick to death of that. What the country wants to know is, do we have a serious long-term investment plan for the railways? The answer is yes. And is the cost of that going to be fairly balanced between the taxpayers and the commuters? And the answer, I hope, is yes. What I want to do more, though, is to make sure commuters feel that when they are paying those fare increases, they're getting value for money. And we know from what the clips you've heard today, from other feedback around the country, indeed from my own journeys on the railway, from Bedwin and Pewsey stations in my constituency, that all too often we haven't got the capacity there. But it will be delivered, we are delivering it, and we want to keep making sure fares are affordable.
OK, we'll leave it there. Claire Perry, thank you very much indeed, and here in the studio, Mary Cray, thank you for coming in. Now, a man's been arrested in Northern Ireland on suspicion of manslaughter after the death of an Afghan found in a shipping container at Tilbury Docks. He was among a group of Sikh migrants who were discovered crammed inside the container on Saturday, many suffering from dehydration and hypothermia. A 34-year-old man will be taken to Essex for questioning later, and in a separate move, police have arrested a German man in Somerset after a group of people were discovered inside a lorry. More on that in a moment, but first, Cordelia Lynch has been tracking down the Tilbury survivors and finding out what's happened since.
This is the building in South London where we found some of the children and adults recovering after they were discovered inside a container at Tilbury Docks. Today they were playing alongside other asylum seekers. It is a place of refuge after a terrifying journey. Javid, our Afghan translator, spoke to some of them inside.
They say that we had gone through a very hardship, that we made our way here, and we can only say that we don't want anybody else to go through those conditions.
Our translator said they were happy to talk to him and are relieved they're now getting food and water. They didn't want to describe the exact circumstances that led up to them being placed on the container, but they did tell him that some of them are from Jalalabad in Afghanistan.
Are you surprised that people from Afghanistan are coming on these containers, or do you think that it is becoming more common?
I think it is becoming more common because of the current situation in Afghanistan. Instead of improving, the situation is deteriorating by each and second day.
This photograph was taken by members of the Afghan Sikh community already settled in Britain, who'd gone to offer help to some of the survivors. We met Hussein, an Iranian who is staying with the group. He said they're still struggling to come to terms with the loss of Meet Singh Kapoor, the man who died on the container, it is believed, in his child's arms.
Physically it's all right, but emotionally everyone is depressed and had stress of what goes next, and this is the situation, but physically and it's okay.
There are still so many unanswered questions about what led to these scenes early on Saturday morning, but police in Northern Ireland have now arrested a 34-year-old man from Limavady in County Londonderry on suspicion of manslaughter and facilitating illegal entry.
How are the little children?
The little children are okay, I think, because they don't understand the condition, and all they know is to play and screaming with the other children.
It is hard to imagine what went through these young minds. Their plight, though, has united the Sikh community in West London and sparked a debate about a side of immigration few knew anything about.
When such genuine refugees have to make such an appallingly perilous journey and losing their lives in the process, I think somewhere our system is broken, that they have to take those chances with their lives when they should be genuinely seeking refuge here as genuine refugees.
They should find out within 6 months whether they'll be granted asylum. In the short term, they're due to be moved to new accommodation. They don't know where, but it is another step in a journey that has already taken them from Afghanistan to South London.
Well, more now on the man who's being held in Somerset after a lorry containing 15 people was discovered at a service station at Ilminster near Taunton. The German national was arrested on suspicion of helping the unlawful entry of people into the UK. Our Home Affairs correspondent Andy Davis has the latest. Andy.
Well, Chris, just before 1 o'clock this afternoon, Avon and Somerset police received a number of disturbing calls about this truck on the A303 not far from here. There were calls from members of the public who said that they were behind the truck and reported hearing banging noises and seeing the back doors of this truck attempt to sort of kick it open. And I understand that the police also received calls on mobiles from some of those inside the lorry, desperate to get out. And this lorry, a German lorry, was on its way from Calais, we understand, on its way to Exeter. The police intercepted it, pulled it over to this service station here, opened up the back doors, and inside found 15 people, 11 men, 3 women, and a 15-year-old boy, desperate, they said, to get out.
When they've opened the vehicle, they found these people very upset, very dehydrated, and very anxious to get out of what was a refrigerated vehicle, so it was very hot. They didn't have any water left, and they were quite distressed.
Just to explain, they were hot because the refrigeration element apparently wasn't on. Now, they said that they had come from Eritrea and Kashmir. 1 or 2 of them, a police officer said to me, spoke a little bit of English, but they were largely dazed, he said. They walked out dazed, not really asking for anything, and they were given, there was no great drama, he said. They were given help from paramedics, and they said that they had got onto the lorry in Calais, that apparently the back doors were open. They just piled in. Now, that's disputed by the driver, who's a German man who has since been arrested and questioned on suspicion of facilitating illegal immigration. As for the 15, they're in a place of safety, say the police, in a local village hall receiving further treatment. So in terms of Tilbury, it's not another Tilbury, thankfully, in terms of the tragic consequences there, but a desperately bleak story all the same.
Thanks, Andy. Still to come tonight. Hello, Salam alaikum. I've been to visit Hala, the injured Palestinian I met in Gaza, who has now been brought to Britain for life-saving treatment. What are her prospects now?
I have got to go back. My husband is there with our other children. Our house has been destroyed and they are still living in the schools there.
Now, in Iraq, Kurdish and Iraqi forces have consolidated their positions at the strategically important Mosul Dam after retaking it from Islamic State fighters. American airstrikes destroyed a number of IS positions. The entrances to the complex are still littered with wreckage. There's also been fighting around Tikrit and south of Erbil, with Kurdish Peshmerga forces claiming to have recaptured a number of towns and villages. Tomorrow, the United Nations begins a 4-day aid operation, sending in supplies by air, sea and road convoy to help more than 1 million people who've been displaced by fighting this year. Well, as the IS forces pushed across northern Iraq, tens of thousands of Yazidis were forced to flee for their lives. Their refuge, the harsh, remote mountain of Sinjar. As their supplies dwindled, Kurdish fighters, backed by American airstrikes, managed to secure a passage for many to escape. Their journey took them from the mountain into Syria and ended in the Nowruz refugee camp. Last week, the Kurdish photojournalist Znako Ismail travelled up to the mountain to meet some of the Yazidis fleeing to relative safety. He told Channel 4 News about their journey.
Last week, tens of thousands of Yazidis fled for their lives through the Syrian desert.
Yazidina. Yazidina. لا كن داري هاتون سرچاي دوش زور سرجي راكي شام كلو خلقها عم بيني يكم يان ترس للرخصار يعني وبرسيارج للشاوي يعني بو يما بو مستهدفين او من دالا لبشتي تراكتورك دانيشتبو طبعا تراكتور وقلا فوتوكا اي بينين لبرتونيتي او من دالا ليو لتشي وشك بوتوا درجة حرارة لنزيك بتشلوسي درجة بوا بلوكي أرواح خوشي نازنت.
The refugees had precious little access to food or water along the route. How many died of dehydration? We just don't know.
شون كسق لبيابانا أبي كبيني خويتي يفرع لخوشيا. أما يجبو شوية ببرتاهم يا أخوان يعني أخوان برو أواك الروشتن خلق هبو مناضي خوي بيرسو خلق هبو بيركاني بيرسو. سلام كان. شان صعد برا كوان. شان صعد لشاقو هاتونا. حب ساعات. 10 ساعات ببي سارة هنا. سارة نين أغاب كتويتنا في دري. دا كتو شيته شيتي. نخوشة. نقارب ماشي. ترى بلا كم بسكرين. بلا كم بسكرين. ئەوەی کە بەلای من و زۆر سەرنجڕاکێشتر بوو مناڵێک بوو مناڵێکی تری لە باوەشا لە کۆڵا بوو مناڵێکی دوو هەواڵیە بەکە یاخود تۆ دایم بە سۆڵجە نایبەری کە لای وەسڵا بوون هاوارم بۆ کردن هاوکاریکی کەن ئەوانیش چوون.
But at the top of Sinjar mountain, hundreds of families remain stranded for days, simply unable to leave it.
زۆر ماوە 200 عائلة ئەی چەند کەس مردووە لەسەرەوە ئێستا من لە ناو چیای شەنگالام لە نێو کۆمەڵە عائیلام کە ماونەتەوە لێرە ئەو تاوە گەیان بینین لە دەم ئەشکەوتە لە دەم ئەمە عائیلانە کە تەیان بینین أما تهليلة برسين هموي بس إيه ما ينزل خرابة كاليري تنرجع وليران دروجة روشي وتشانا سعرها هنا بونا رون
سعرنينا كاسك ما بنا هم بلنقال كما مشي
أيوة صحيح وتشوا
ولا إيمانينا نينا زاد نينا
جامعة بالرجاء برونا ويقلو فلين حتى قنا كامبين وروس شنك الرجاء بشتيانا كويتا تقريبا لكونا ما بيني 11 دوجار نكجاري كيش أم ديودي أو شنا داعشي لي وترسي وهي بقناص لي ما بدري وترسي وهي كلب إما زيادة من خطي خوارم قد
Syrian Kurdish fighters from the YPG did what they could to escort families along this route.
زوربي أو إزدياني كالأشياء يعني إنه وليرة أفضلني صراحتي أم بيكن لا يخوان دينا إيرا وأمانة أفضلني يبقى وتاتشون هاي كاري أنا كان بعسيري كي ما بكين زي ما هفالا هاي كاري ذكات يكلها هفالا هاي كاري ما حتى ذكات أو من دالا ناوي إبراهيم 18 صالة أو من دالا لكسكاركي دابرابو وكسك لو لنيو أو سعري أبو لنيو أو دوطانيا أبو كبينيم أفرتك من لقلا بيني وأفرتها اللي قرتبو لقل خوا أي بربوناو كامبين وروس تاوكو بزانيا آية كسكاري لوي هنيانين أو أفرتك يبر بينو تبوكا كسكاري لوي ياليني بلام.
Many hours from Sinjar Mountain, there is safety here in the Nowroz refugee camp in Syria.
بعام وكو رزقار كردين دزا 10 رخصاري جوان وخوشيان هبو لو روا بلام لروي اوشو كلا كامبا منو كدهاتوكي نادي رويان تيكا دلخوش نبون.
A remarkable account of the Yazidis coming off Mount Sinjar. Now, Israel says a newly agreed ceasefire has been violated after rockets were fired into the country from Gaza. In response, Israel's military has begun to strike targets in the Gaza Strip once again. A 5-day ceasefire had been extended for 24 hours last night, while delegations from Israel and Hamas tried to reach a deal to end the weeks of fighting. But the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, said he'd now order his negotiating team in Cairo to return home. Hamas has denied firing rockets across the Gaza border. Well, when I was in Gaza earlier this month, I met 3-year-old Hala. She was seriously ill and living in a crowded UN school with her family after their home was flattened by the Israeli bombardment. A British doctor and charity managed to get her out and eventually on to London for life-saving surgery. And today I went to find out how she's been getting on. She is a girl transformed. With oxygen now pulsing properly through Hala's body, it's as though the life has rushed back in. Her complex congenital heart defect couldn't be treated in Gaza, so a team at the Royal Brompton in London carried out the surgery, funded by the charity Chain of Hope. The surgeon, Professor Lacour Gaillet, says he's fixed her plumbing.
There was very little blood going to the lungs. We operated in emergency on a Monday morning. We fixed what we had to fix, enlarged the pulmonary artery, and closed the hole, and she did well. It is an operation that works well. I mean, with very limited mortality, and they recover beautifully, which is amazing. Is immediately they become pink, and saturation is normal, and they go back to life and behave like a normal little child, you know?
Just 2 weeks ago, her life was a world away. Hala was a listless child sleeping on the floor of a UN school in Gaza, sheltering from Israeli airstrikes. Her home had already been destroyed in the bombing. A single oxygen cylinder keeping her alive.
When she is tired, she is completely dying. Without this medication, she will be gone.
A British doctor, David Knott, working with the charity, escorted her out during a window of ceasefire. David, hi, how are you?
Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.
Yes.
We caught up with them along the way.
She's done well on the crossing. It's taken us about 5 hours to get through so far, and there's been a few tears here and there, and she's been a bit unhappy because Mummy couldn't come with her because she had to go a different route. But it's delightful now that Mummy and her are together again.
And Knott says the flight to Britain was literally heart-stopping.
At about halfway through the flight, she collapsed. And she was completely white, she was pulseless, and the heart stopped. So there was a frantic half a minute of me trying to revive her. I gave her a couple of puffs in her face and then did some cardiac massage, turned the oxygen right up to 6 litres, and then she suddenly revived herself.
Hala's set to leave hospital tomorrow and will be cleared to fly home within a couple of weeks. Her mother, delighted at her daughter's health, remains terrified about returning to the floor of that UN school.
I have got to go back. My husband is there with our other children. Our house has been destroyed and they are still living in the schools there.
So they're still in that school?
No.
So are you going to have to take Hala back to that school?
No.
That's not very good.
What can we do?
She also remains scared about returning at all. The war between Israel and Hamas began again today. It is a grim and senseless reality of a 3-year-old life saved, returning to risk being the next child killed in the fighting. Now, teenagers say that internet pornography is distorting, damaging and unrealistic. That's according to a poll of 500 18-year-olds by the IPPR think tank that's been shown to this programme. Of those surveyed, 8 out of 10 18-year-olds say it is too easy for young people to accidentally see pornography online. 7 out of 10 say accessing pornography was seen as typical while they were at school. Almost half say sending sexual or naked photos or videos is part of everyday life for teenagers nowadays. 7 out of 10 say pornography leads to unrealistic attitudes to sex. Of young women surveyed, almost 8 out of 10 say pornography has led to pressure on girls or young women to look a certain way, while almost as many say pornography has led to pressure on girls and young women to act a certain way.
Young women in particular are really feeling pressured by the ease of access to online pornography to look and act in certain ways. And I think that's really dangerous in setting norms, not only around sex, but around relationships as well. And the other key message, I think, that in the absence of other high-quality education around sex and relationships, for many people, the internet and the ease of access to online pornography is providing them with their education around sex and relationships. And again, if we think about what that means, what particularly young men are looking at, what they might be accessing, what they might be learning, that really sets some unrealistic expectations.
Well, joining me now are Ellen Adams, a 23-year-old medical student who runs an organisation teaching sex education to teenagers. Laura Mugford is 16. We met her 2 years ago as part of our Generation Sex series. And Amelia Coleman, who's 15, and who has previously spoken to Channel 4 News about the blurred lines around consensual sex. So, Amelia, let me start with you. I mean, do these statistics tally with your own experience?
Yes, I think so, because in school I hear a lot of chat about pictures. I've seen a lot of pictures, and I think it really affects how you go about your daily life, seeing pictures of people you supposedly used to know, and yeah, just how you react to people around you.
So are you saying pornography is just an everyday part of teenage life?
It has
for most teenagers.
It has become that way. I mean, I think it's more for boys. Boys watch it a lot more, and you just hear about it all the time.
Laura, would you say the same?
Yeah, I'd say I completely agree with the boy thing. I know from my group of friends, none of them, well, the girls at least, watch it at all.
So how do you know the boys are watching it?
Well, it's quite an open thing that they would discuss with people. Jokes are always made about how.
But teenage boys brag and lie all the time, don't they? I mean...
Very true. But I think generally boys are more open about that sort of thing, and they actually talk to girls a bit more about almost their standards that they think of us set by watching it. That they kind of almost are trying to explain to us how they expect us to act with them just from watching it online.
Ellen, do you think, I mean, these two certainly think, certainly with boys, that pornography on the internet is a part of their everyday lives. Is that your hunch, experience from teaching sex education?
I think so, definitely. I think that I found in classes that the topic of pornography does come up a lot. But actually, when we start talking to young people in a safe environment, in an environment with a young person who they can relate to, they actually start to talk about sex in a much more mature way, and they're actually given that opportunity to discuss it. And by providing sex education, you're almost negating or neutralising the effect that pornography can have on young people's lives.
Is it necessarily a bad thing?
Is it necessarily a bad thing? I mean, it's an interesting question, and not necessarily, but if not contextualised with proper, comprehensive sex education, I think the possibilities of damage are much greater.
Amelia, do you think it's a bad thing? I mean, do you think it's affecting behaviour? I mean, when you say it affects your life, I mean, what do you mean?
Personally, I think it's a bad thing because I've never actually watched porn because the talk of it just puts me off. I don't feel like I need to because I've formed an opinion from what I've heard from friends in school and what I've heard from my mum and my parents. But I do think that it affects the way boys see women. I think in porn they're seen as objects, and I think that's such a bad thing because I think it's so disrespectful to women in general. And I think that if boys watch porn before they've had sex, then they have an image in their heads of what a woman's body should look like and what that kind of sex should be like. And
that's what those 18-year-olds in the survey are talking about when they say it changes their expectations of how to look and how to act.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you would say as well?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it sets a really unrealistic standard of what women are supposed to look like and B, actually perform like. I think it completely, if you're having an actual education with a person that can talk to you and you can talk back to them and feel comfortable and actually get the proper facts about it as opposed to what you're seeing from a camera that's probably not truthful, it kind of, I think it just completely sets an unrealistic standard for what women these days are supposed to be like in both everything, really.
I mean, Ellen, a lot of people will be watching this saying, but, you know, people have had access to pornography in some form for an awful long time. You know, it's been very likely that teenage boys will have seen images, you know, their first sexual experience will have been with a piece of paper. You know, so they will have strange expectations of what real sex is. I mean, has anything really changed? I mean, is it about, you know, the amount that they're consuming, or what? Or the regularity?
Well, obviously we have the smartphone revolution where everyone has access to porn, but I think it doesn't really matter to me, like, the ubiquity of it in society. I think what we need to be doing is prioritising young people's decision-making process, informing young people enough so that they can make their own informed decisions about their sexual health.
But what does the internet have to do with this? I mean, is what I'm trying to get at. Has the internet changed anything here, or is this the same set of pressures that we've always had in society?
I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. I think that there is definitely a problem with misinformation on the internet. I mean, if somebody wants to find out information that they're not being provided in school, and it's quite an awkward topic for parents to be talking about, if they do Google something like sex, you are much more likely to come across a porn site or a great website like Brooke or or the Family Planning Association, which is actually providing comprehensive and sensible information.
Can I just ask you two both, very briefly, because we've only got a bit of time. I mean, would you want more sex education? Do you think sex education is the answer?
Definitely. I think that the more informed you are, the more information that you have to make a decision as to what is actual fact.
And in your experience, is sex education handled well?
I've had a few lessons/days in school, but I definitely think it needs to be enforced more, definitely, because I think, like she said, I just think that the more you know about it, the more able you are to make an informed decision.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you very much. Now, he's one of the world's top-selling authors, part writer, part modern-day philosopher. Paulo Coelho's novels are sold in their tens of millions, so fans eager to discover his secret to the meaning of life. But does he really have the answers? He's easily Brazil's biggest fiction writer. The Alchemist, the book that propelled Paulo Coelho into fame and fortune, is printed in 56 languages. His stories have sold 165 million copies. He's worth over $530 million. But success didn't fall at his feet. institutionalized at 17 by his parents for being bookish and introvert. He was later imprisoned in the 70s for writing subversive songs about Brazil's military rule. More recently, the writer was an ambassador for Brazil's World Cup bid. He hoped the event would change the country's body and soul. In the end, he branded it a disaster, refusing to attend the tournament, which he felt had caused a social explosion.
What is the meaning of life? Answer: I don't know.
He's almost obsessed with social media. The author has a loyal 9.4 million followers on Twitter. Personal videos and messages to fans have in return provided a fertile source of research for new books. His latest is no exception. What began as an online discussion about depression ended in a book about adultery. It's the story of a woman who cheats on her husband to find it doesn't ruin their marriage. Reviews have been mixed, though. Verdicts range from masterpiece to tedious. Well, I've been talking to Paulo Coelho. How much has his writing been affected by his engagement with fans online?
My role in social media is basically because it gives me a lot of fun, of course. I enjoy connecting to readers, and I have a better possibility to interact with them. Having said that, the answer is more or less. At the very beginning, I thought I have to discuss something that it is relevant. I thought it was depression, and my reader said, no, it is adultery, betrayal. So I said, okay, let's discuss betrayal, and I started talking to them. And then I realized that the subject was much more complicated than a simple post on Twitter or Facebook, and I decided to write a book about it.
So you want people to take a message, do you, that an affair doesn't need to be the end of a relationship?
Well, it's not a message. It is. I tell my own experience. Okay, so when I've been married for 35 years, and during just 35 years, at the very beginning of my relationship, I cannot tell you that I was the most faithful husband on earth, and the same goes for my wife. She had one or two affairs, and we were able to overcome, and that was our best decision in life, because now we are married for 35 years. It happened at the very beginning, and, well, what can I tell you? It happens.
You've written this book about a woman, really through the eyes of a woman. I just wonder why you did that and whether you feel qualified.
Oh, yeah, I am a woman. I look like a man, but the creative process is basically a feminine one, in the sense that you are there and you are giving birth to something that you're not fully conscious.
Is it difficult to write about sex, though, from a woman's perspective when you're a man? Because there's...
If you really had a very good relationship with your wife, you will know how to write a book about sex from the feminine perspective. If you can't, you are a very bad or lousy partner.
So I'm assuming you're very good. What do you make of the way people have received your book? Because it's getting some sort of mixed reception, isn't it?
Always. This is my blessing. It always gets mixed reception from the very beginning, from my first book, The Alchemist, up to today. And that means that I'm not this person who always writes the same thing and pleases everybody.
Does it bother you?
So, and this is for me, no, on the opposite. It pleases me. If a book is good, it is going to sell. If a book is not good, it does not sell. It happened to me with one book. The Winner Stands Alone. That book did not sell at all, but it did not stop me from writing.
Just speaking about Brazil, I don't want to go over the World Cup because that's been and gone, but the Olympics is coming up. And I wondered whether you feel the same issues apply to the Olympics and the people of Brazil and the money that's being spent.
I don't know about the Olympics, but for Brazil, the World Cup was a disaster. And we're going to pay this debt for the years to come. At the end of the day, I think that they spent a lot of money, and it was basically nepotism.
And do you worry that the same thing will happen with 2016 and the Olympics? I
don't know. I'm not a prophet. I hope not. But if you look now, probably. But I try to think positive. It is my country. It is my money at the end of the day because I pay taxes. So I hope that this time they learn the lesson of the World Cup.
Paula Coelho. Tonight's main news, another night of racially charged violence on the streets of Ferguson, Missouri, over the police shooting of a black teenager. 78 people were arrested last night after police said they came under heavy gunfire, blaming outsiders with no connection to the local community. Do follow our correspondent Kylie Morris, who's on the ground there in Ferguson. Until tomorrow, that's Channel 4 News. Have a very good night.
Expect seasonal highs at tea time.